Okay, folks, it's the 14th of October, Anthropology, Group 1, morning session. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics again, and in particular, collective ethics, which is something that maybe is an idea still in formation. But first of all, I just want to get some help. Who wants to volunteer? This is Kakmak, Das Kapital, Volume 1. Okay, since you know. I think this translation, Nơi nào mà lao động,
nơi nào mà
mà
lao
long
động
đong,
của
thuần
con
nuôi đa đen,
đúng rồi.
con bị lang nước
thì
ở
ở
đấy
đấy lao
là
động
đồng
của
thuần nuôi đa trang.
skin white
Yeah, không thể nào được giải
phóng.
phóng. Okay, so nuôi đa đen comes first in that sentence. Yeah, that's very interesting because as you'll see later on, in the English and in the German, in the original German, it's the other way around. The worker in the white skin cannot be free, while the worker in the black skin is in chains, not humiliated or not bilang but in chains. So black, then white. In this one, but in the German, white, then black. And in a way, the Tiếng Việt version is better. Anyway, okay, so today, for anthropology, is this thing working? It's not. Oh yeah, it's on. Thank you. For anthropology, okay, the question of culture is crucial, but for a long time, the question of minorities was dominant, all right? So it's not always the case now that anthropologists only look at the minority groups, but traditionally, that's what they do, right? And that's their claim to be different to sociology. Sociology looks at modern society, and anthropology looks at, but see the assumption built into that? The assumption built into that is that marginal people, minority people, ethnic people, they are not modern somehow. But of course they are, right? They're alive now. So it's a racist structure. But anthropology has started to change that a little. But you know, we still do talk about minority groups, and we have an interest, and somebody must take an interest, right? Sociologists, their bias often is not to look at minority groups, or if they do, they look at how minority groups are subject to racist exclusion, or they look at diaspora or something like that. They look from the perspective of the whole, of the mainstream. So anyway, we must look at this history and learn something from it. And interestingly, so I've been reading about this in Vietnam, the question of minorities has a story that allegedly, is it true or not? You know many things about Ho Chi Minh, maybe elaborations for lessons, right? He met a soldier who challenged him for his papers. What a good soldier, and so on. These stories that you learn something from. So maybe, but the story goes that in the early 1950s, when Ho Chi Minh is in the mountains, he was being supported, he and the other revolutionaries in the fight against the French, was supported by the hill people, the mountain people, the highlanders. And acknowledging this support and their commitment and care, for the revolution, they start to say, well, okay, these are not kin like us, but how many of such people are there in Vietnam? How many minority groups are there? And no one could answer. No one knew. So the story goes. You can tell that I don't quite, it sounds like it could be a bit of a story. But so the story goes, Back Ho asked how many tribes were there and how many minority groups were there. And so then the response came with, we don't know. And the president then asked Vietnamese ethnologists, anthropologists to find out. Go forth and do research. Here's your task, like a prime directive or an order call from the president. How many ethnic groups were there and what are their customs and composition? Let's build some knowledge about them, which is great. For anthropologists to have the government from the start say, go and do your work, everybody must have been pretty happy. Quite often, it's like the government is, no, we can't have anthropologists sniffing around, don't be annoying. I mean, why do you even exist? How do you help people get jobs? What's your contribution to the economy? No, anthropologists sometimes find it hard to justify their existence, which is why Malinowski and the colonial, or the whole colonial story is anthropologists helping the colonial power. In this case, something different was happening. In 1958, the first group of ethnologists began working on a project which would take nearly the next 2 decades, which is to find out to count how many minorities there were and to document their lives. Now we saw the CIA's version, or the US Army's version of that. But there's also a version of it done by Vietnamese ethnologists, anthropologists. And it's much more extensive. And I'm just starting to read into it. Very little of it is translated, actually. But my phone is now full of translations of some of these documents. Of course, some is translated and some is really easily accessible. Condominus, for example. Of course, that was written in French first. And actually, the French anthropologists contributed as well. But really, it was the Vietnamese project, the minorities project that made anthropology in this country. The Ethnic Classification Project. And there's an essay you can read about this by Dang Nghiêm Van. And they found that there are 54 minorities. Hooray, not 52, not 55, 54. Okay. If you now go to the new wing, well, the old wing, the refurbished wing of the Historical Museum in District 1 by the zoo, you'll see a fairly new display of the minorities of Vietnam. I can't remember what was there before, but they changed it in December of November 2018. November, December. It was closed in the second half of 2018. And then it opened, I think, November. It's only one room, but a big room, maybe twice the size of this room, right? And they fit all the minorities in there. So it's not really that informative, but it's worth a day, half a day. And what you see in there, some of it's a bit like predictable, maybe even cliche. You find some drums, some instruments, some canoes, some weaving material, some baskets, right? Classic ethnographic artifacts. Has anyone been to see this exhibit? It's been 2 years it's open now. Well, nearly. Has anyone been to the Historical Museum in the last 2 years? No one? Okay, maybe we should go as a class excursion. All right, let's think about that. Would you be interested? Instead of having class in a couple of weeks' time, we'll go to the museum and look at that section. I think that'll be interesting. Other things are changing in the museum as well. The Historical Museum is updating because I think it got a new head, a new person in charge. I met him, a scholar, really nice guy. I thought a bit flamboyant in his dress, but not completely like, not a manager type, more like a scholar type. So interesting. Maybe we can get him to meet with us on the day. I don't know if that's possible. I'll try and organize that. Have to get permission from the university to go outside and for a trip, and some bureaucratic stuff is required, but we can do that. Anyway, they are also changing other parts of the museum. For example, they used to have a very old, dusty and not updated for maybe a decade section on China, on Chinese, the 1,000 years of Chinese occupation of Vietnam. Right? And it had some beautiful old pieces of ceramic and some, I just remember a porcelain horse, like a classic thing, and then some representations of the emperor's soldiers and so on. But they've closed that section and replaced it with something like modern museum studies stuff. What do you think it is? A video documentary. So the room, which had these beautiful artifacts and so on, was just not very exciting, and they replaced it with an ongoing video on a loop. They kept some of the dioramas. Do you know what a diorama is? Diorama. It's, if you go to a lot of museums, right, which I do because her research is on prison museums. So we go to a lot of museums and we take our kids. Their idea of fun is going to a museum and putting on shackles and seeing all the instruments of torture. If you go to museums a lot, you start to become a fan of how museums present their material. And in the fantastic India Museum in Calcutta, as well as in the Historical Museum here in Ho Chi Minh City, and in other old museums, but it's dying out. They have these things called dioramas. A diorama is a model of some historical thing. And what they've got in the History Museum here in Ho Chi Minh City is one life-size diorama where you have mannequins, like models of people from ancient times sitting around a fire, cooking some buffalo or something, and the woman is looking after the children or weaving some basket or something like that. A representation in 3D of people's lives. But there's also in the History Museum a couple of display cases, they're called vitrines, display cases, within which you see great battles between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. So the one where the stakes were driven into the harbor to repel the ships, another battle on a hillside that was very bloody, and so on. And these dioramas have been kept, and that's fantastic good news for us because I was worried when they started to renovate the museum, they might lose these somewhat kitsch but fantastic objects. They didn't. But in the minorities room, happily there are no new dioramas, but they can be a bit kitsch. But you see, of course, there's a canoe and some baskets, and you see some weapons, and there's musical instruments. Musical instruments are very interesting, actually. Some xylophone, glockenspiel, xylophone, whatever it's called, and drums, and so on. Now, it's interesting that Ho Chi Minh had asked for this project, and this project became a national project. The ethnologists were, like, I think it's unusual, unlike elsewhere, that a project on the minorities was authorized, ordered, or coming down from the president, and in a way was a party project. Like in the same way that the literacy project was a project of the party, the literacy campaign and so on. In a way, this study of anthropology of the minorities was party approved, a campaign. So the army was, in a way, contributing to this study. And the People's Army of Vietnam, they were known for their technique of integrating with the local people. Right? They had the three togethers, Ba Kung, right? To eat with, to live with, and to work with the people. A really common thing with People's Army, Communist Army, like the Chinese Maoists as well, was to have sort of these credos, rules, the three togethers or the eight whatevers of Mao and so on. Now, but it's really unusual for this then to become a model for ethnographic research, like, and fantastic in a way. The three togethers, are you with me? The three togethers, Ba Kung, right, was similar to, I suppose, took the place of what in English anthropology is the Malinowski fieldwork method, right, participant observation. But this was really, this is another way of saying participant observation. Eat together, live together, work together. So the ethnologists took this as their credo, and they developed a real rapport, a real respect for, an engagement with the people. You can feel this, you can see this if you do read the George Condominis book, but in the others as well. I mean, I'm sure ethnologist to ethnologist, personality of the anthropologist really plays a big part. I mean, a good anthropologist, what kind of personality do they need? But the same with a good communist, right? If you read Dung Kak Minh, The Revolutionary Path, 1927 by Ho Chi Minh, you see the first couple of pages, he lists the qualities of a good communist, good party member. Well, in a way, maybe we need to think about what is the personality, what is the qualities for a good ethnographer. Must be able to listen, must have respect for people, must be a bit outgoing, willing to play games with kids, to learn, to set aside as many of their biases as possible. We can imagine making, this might be a project one day, imagine making a kind of study of the psychological and personal traits required to be a good ethnographer. And maybe Malinowski wouldn't qualify because some of the things that we find out he had in his personal psychological makeup were maybe a bit problematic. Evans Pritchard also maybe a bit arrogant. You can't be arrogant. You can't be prejudiced. You have to be very patient, show respect, willing to learn, share. So there's something to be said for the way in which this credo from the party entered into the Anthropology project, finding the minorities. Now, subsequently, ethnography has an interesting history in this country. And the Ethnographic Museum, or the anthropologists' work that went into museums, was also subject then to legal issues, and still is today, in a way that wouldn't be true for as much for, or not in the same way at least, for some ethnographic museums or ethnographic aspects of museums elsewhere. The law on cultural heritage and the Ministry, Department of Culture have a big say in how the representation of minorities will be made. To call them minorities, for example, not tribal people or hill tribes, which is what the French called them, right? Because those names, tribes, they are somehow like an element of primitivism and racism, and also not really a part of the national project, whereas minorities stresses a minority is a part of the nation, right? The tribe isn't a separate autonomous entity, right? But when you say minority, you're immediately also invoking the idea of majority, aren't you? If you say marginal, you mean center as well at the same time, because these words are relational. When you say tribe, you kind of also mean, I don't know, what is the opposite of tribe? Civilization or something. So it's a bit more racist. And so it's an interesting and welcome, I think, stipulation that these be called minority groups. They are numerically a minority, so it's a factual description. They make up a very small percentage of Vietnam. I think in total 3 or 4% only. Kin are like 96, 97%, at least as I understand. I don't know if that's changing. Like it might be with intermarriage, with people leaving the mountain areas for the lowlands or for the cities. Maybe. I think there's quite a bit of that. But the thing is that ethnographic museums are subject to law, and more recently, they've been also asked to carry out internationalization, international cooperation. Now, what does that mean? It's very interesting that there is internationally, and this operates through a lot of the global museums, a First Peoples network. So for anthropologists, this is a political thing. First Peoples refers to what? Can you think? What are they first in? First Peoples. They are the first there, the original people of the land, the first inhabitants. So for Australia, Australian Aboriginals who've been there for 70, 80,000 years before white people came. Captain Cook and so on. Okay, in Asia, it's a bit different because you can talk of 1,000 years of different cultural shifts and movement of different people who were the original inhabitants of the mountain areas. Go back through the Cham and before that and before that. Right? But in places like the Americas, it's also easier. Right? The first peoples are the Apache and the Navajo and the Iroquois and all these Native American, indigenous people, indigenous from that land. Okay, so then you can talk about indigenous French, the original French, or indigenous Britons, although that's slightly problematic because we call British Anglo-Saxon, so they're already mixed, right? But what were the original Britons before the French came? Normandy, 1066, the French came and conquered England and made England the modern, well, not so modern for a long time, but made England what it is, Anglo-Saxon, Normandy, 1066, all of that. The original Britons, like, it's not the same as First Peoples because the rhetoric is different. It's more like a racist nationalism, King Arthur and so on. First Nations or First Peoples usually refers to Aboriginal groups. Now, is the museum linking with those groups? That's a real political issue. And I am waiting to see the consequences of anthropology in 2009 being given a new status. So still fairly young. Okay, we have anthropology departments at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities and Social Sciences. I can't remember what it's called. Yeah. Anyway, there's an anthropology department there which goes back, but we don't have one here. We've talked about it with the dean 3 deans ago. Actually, when I first came, that was the plan. That plan got pushed back by lots of other things. I mean, maybe we should have an anthropology degree, maybe not. Maybe we should go for something more modern, visual anthropology, or just have ethnography as a method within the social sciences. I think that discussion is for us all to have. But I think it's more important not to worry about the law or worry about the international agencies or what other anthropology departments look like, but to think what we can learn from the way in which ethnology, anthropology in Vietnam had already practiced. So the Army's contribution, Ba Kung, right? The three, it suggests that there's a ethical practice that came from the party to ethnography, ethnology here, that maybe should be the basis for thinking about what an anthropology department in a modern sense would be. For me, that will take some questions to be thought about that are ethical. Not just ethical like guidelines, as we discussed last week. Something else. If you think about anthropology as a discipline, in the world, my guess, and it's a really rough guess, is that there have been 100,000 Mochamnin, 100,000 anthropologists, probably more. Let's say that there are 30 anthropology departments in England, maybe 100 across Europe, 150, 300 in Americas, another 100 in Australia, Asia, and other places. University of South Pacific has one, for example, and so on. Let's say there are 600 departments of anthropology. All right, there weren't 600 at the beginning, there was only a handful, but for 100 years, there have been anthropology departments growing, and now each department, probably each year, produces just 3, 2, 3, 4 maybe graduates. All right, going back, it was smaller numbers, but if you times 600 by 4 by 100, and then take off 600 by 2 by 100, by 3 by 100, let's say by 2 by 100 because there were less, 100 years, that means over this time 100,000 anthropologists have existed. That's a lot of knowledge, a lot of people going out to do field work. Like it's an army. You think about that contribution to knowledge. Of course, there are more sociologists, there are so many geographers, there are so many, but just think of what potential there is in internationalization. If there have been, I mean, many of them are dead already, right? There have been this amazing contribution to global knowledge, to pick up the stories of so many Indigenous people. Of the 100,000, not enough of them are Indigenous people trained in anthropology, but that's increasing, that Aboriginal people become anthropologists of their own culture. That is increasing, and a good thing. But 100,000 anthropologists, and if you've been listening to what I've been saying the last bunch of weeks, one of the issues has been bias and racism. So do they do no harm? 100,000 people doing surveillance work on the minorities, effectively. We need an ethical code. We need to think of what ethics will be, and not in an individual way, because there's so many. In 100,000 anthropologists, we're going to have so many different personalities. Please, saints. So many. So this whole approach to minorities and others is political. It's massive. It can't be something that is left to individual choice. We need a code, but what's the criteria for that code? Should it be individualistic or something more like the party contribution in Vietnam? I want to talk about this in terms of Marxism. You see the old man with the beard is there. So, Các Mác, he has a very interesting chapter in Capital where he talks about, in a way, the organization of the working class. And while he doesn't use the word in that chapter, solidarity, he's talking about getting together as an organization in an organized way in solidarity with the people to achieve their interests and their aims. So here, this is the interesting bit that I just asked you to look at before. In the chapter, which is chapter 8 in the Tiếng Viet version, which itself is very interesting because the working day, Ngày lao động, the working day chapter in the German original was chapter 3, part 4 of chapter 3. But then, right in 1867, Marx wrote the first version of this book. And the working day chapter was chapter 3, part 4. And there were 5 parts of chapter 3. In the versions that we read now, this version and the Common English version, whether it be the Penguin one or the International Press one, it's the 4th German edition that they translate from, or the 3rd German edition for the Aveling translation, the 4th one for the Folks translation. There's a new translation being made. It's interesting because the last version that Marx produced was in French in 1872. And in that book, the working day chapter is number 8. And in the German edition that adopts Engels made in 1887, Engels made a new German edition which adopted the changes Marx put into the French one. So follow me on this. Marx writes Capital in 1867 after many years of work, right? And people were waiting for it. He wrote the first version in 1857, and like he had the manuscript 1863, but people are saying, publish it, and he kept on changing it and changing it and changing it. You see, right up until the last days, the middle of the year, 1867, he's still adding material, because you can see from the references. He puts in the blue books, the reports from the British government on children in factories and so on. But this comes out in 1867. In 1872, Marx rewrites the thing in French. In Think Up, he spoke French, right? So it's written in 1867 in German, and Marx rewrites it, translates and rewrites it on a monthly basis, serialized. Like one section came out each month for 3 years, 1872 to 1875, in French. And it's very different to the version that came out in 1867. So different that what was part 4 of chapter 3 in the 1867 German version is now part 8. And then in the subsequent German, as I said, that Engels put together, Marx never did another one. All the versions of Capital after that, the 1873 one in German was pretty much the same as 1867, but by 1887, a new German edition was prepared, and it included the changes. 87, right? Marx had been dead for 4 years by then, already dead. Chetroy. So Engels changed it largely to the last version that Marx did. He changed it. Why do you think from 1867, 1872, that's how many years? 3, 4, 5 years. A book he worked on for 20 years, why did he change it so much just in 1872? What happened? Do you know your history? What happened to make it imperative that Marx should work so hard to change the text both into a different language, French, and even the shape of the argument? Not the argument as such, but how the argument was introduced. What had happened? Do you know? A very important year. The Commune. The Commune was an uprising of the French proletariat, and they took power for 3 months or so in France. They were surrounded by the French army and the German army, who had invaded Paris, actually. And the German army had kidnapped a lot of the French, captured a lot of the French army, and then released them to go and put down the Commune because they were afraid that the working class had, for the first time ever, formed a government, a dictatorship of the proletariat, the first one ever. And okay, Marx didn't think it would succeed, but he supported it, and he did a lot of work to support those who were fleeing from the reprisals because they were slaughtered mercilessly. In a man called Thiers, and the French army cracked down on the Commune. The revolutionaries of the Commune, right, we call it communism, the Commune, the collective government of the workers, the first time. They were suppressed by the French state. Many of them were executed, killed, slaughtered, but many were also imprisoned and exiled away from France. Where did they put them? Condau. They put them in the prison island of Condau, and also Devil's Island in Guyana, in South America, and other places like that. But while this revolution eventually failed, Marx supported it, and he saw that the French workers were really in need of a theory to comprehend the enormity of the task they had to do to win against capitalism. So he wanted to write Capital in French for the French workers and to make it more readily understood by them. So he rewrites it. But actually, that commitment to where are the workers, who is the audience, who will I best address this work, was built already there in that chapter, The Working Day. It's really interesting to look at how he wrote The Working Day. The chapter, so it's chapter 8 in Tiếng Việt. In English, it's chapter 10, actually, because in the English version, it breaks up chapter 3 into 3 parts, so they lose two. Anyway, chapter 8, in the version we read now, starts off with the individual worker. See, I think there's an ethics to be learned from this. And the path of the chapter, Marx is writing how he organizes his chapter. I think it's a lesson for how we write, how he plans his argument. Right? In this chapter, it's like the ethnographic chapter. He wants to present his evidence of what has been the experience of the workers when they fight for their rights. Thank you. Yeah. Let's wait, patient, they're slowing down. So we can retrospectively kind of reconstruct his essay plan. That's what I want to do, really. And we can learn something from this in terms of ethics. So in the essay, it's almost like this kind of thing. He has an overall argument, which he wants to say that in the workers' fight to reduce the number of hours that they have to work, we see an interesting progression. They try to survive, and they have to work 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And that's what was the condition of the workers in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s in the factories in Britain. 16-hour days, and not just adults working those hours, kids as well working horrendously long hours. And Marx gives the documentation of all this. He gives many examples using what's called the blue books. And that's very interesting because the blue books are like the ethnography. In this chapter, the blue books were government inquiries. They were books produced by the so-called factory inspectors. And the factory inspectors went to have a look for themselves at the condition of the factories, and they reported back to the government in these blue books. Okay. Leonard Horner was the chief inspector of factories. So he should be really the next anthropologist we adopt. Leonard Horner. Like, I want to put his name up there with Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, Malinowski, and Clifford Geertz, and say he too was an anthropologist. Of course, before that, Marx points out that Engels had already been there. In Engels' book, 1844, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which he went and spoke with the Irish factory workers in Manchester, because his girlfriend was Irish, right? He got access. He details in very, very, very excellent, close empirical reporting the condition of the workers. And the condition of the workers is terrible, right? They work these horrendous hours. They live in hovels, in squalor. Their food is bread and soup and not that much meat and so on, right? They're malnourished, unhealthy work conditions, they have various sicknesses. All that is documented. In fact, Marx says in this chapter, he's not going to do much more from before 1844 because Engels already did it so well. And then he takes the blue books between 1830 to 66 to update Engels. Now, of course, Leonard Horner is not without problems. He's not a trained anthropologist, but a kind of sociologist. But even then, when he goes to visit the factories, he leaves from London, goes on a coach or a train or whatever up to the north of England to the factories. He's often the guest, the house guest of the factory owners. And like before he visits a factory, the night before he has dinner with the factory owner and his daughters, and they have a kind of like, oh yes, it's all jolly. And then he gets shown the factories in their best light, right? They hide the children who are working. They hide some of the worst conditions. But sometimes he does see quite a lot, and it's interesting that his reports are not welcomed by the factory owners. In fact, the government starts to say we need to regulate this because these children are not, they're working horrendous hours and they're not getting any education. So the second section, there are actually 7 sections in the chapter, is on education and work of kids in the factories. And Marx gives so many examples in this to show that the government had tried to regulate the working hours of at least children and tried to introduce education for them. Why did he want them educated? Because an educated workforce works better and so on. And they introduced 2 hours per week education at first. And then it became longer. Then there were restrictions. A child under 12 could not work more than 6 hours without a break, for example. You're looking up a word. You can ask. Otherwise, you turn it off. They tried to regulate this system, but the workers were still working long hours. So we've got the information, we've got the situation. Next, the workers trying to agitate for the 10-hour and then the 8-hour day. And he documents then examples from the bakers, and they have leaflets that they've handed out complaining about their work, or the bricklayers, their conditions, or workers in Lewisham or in Deptford. He documents many examples of the workers kind of standing up and agitating for their conditions. So it's again ethnographic. But what's interesting and what's developed that he shows, and he does this, right? So he shows campaigns. He does this, has these 3 big points, and shows a progression. And he does this by starting off by saying, here is the voice of the worker complaining about their hours. And he quotes an individual worker who says to the capitalist, you take my time. I pay you, you pay me, and I give you my time for the day. But you take so much of it, and then you make profit. And you always want to take more. And the chapter's great. It says capital is like a vampire sucking on the blood on the flesh of the workers. It's like a werewolf. All these metaphors of vampires all through the chapter. But that's the start. The individual worker just complaining, but not doing anything yet beyond complaining. But then by showing all the evidence, the blue books by the government, the failure of policy, the campaigns of the workers, at the end, he quotes a collective who agitate for the 10-hour and then the 8-hour day. And they speak as a group. So here's the progression of his chapter. From individual voice, which is not very effective, is just complaining, to a whole lot of voices together, agitating, insisting that there be limits to the amount of hours that the capitalists can suck. If you sell your labor for a day, what is a day? There needs to be regulation. The government tries to regulate it but doesn't achieve it. Only when the workers mobilize themselves and demand it does it get introduced. The 10-hour day, and then, after Marx is dead, of course, the 8-hour day. The thing about this that I want to stress, and we'll have a break, is that this collective movement really is there in effectively Marx's ethnographic chapter. He uses his mobilization of all the data about the workers in an ethnographic way, goes and have a look for himself, or at least Leonard Horner does, but then organizes it to make the point about the need for the workers to come together as a team, as a group, to fight for their rights. That, of course, is what the factory has already done, brought them together as a group. But now, instead of the capitalist bringing them together as a group to work for him, they come together and fight for their own rights. Now, I'm going to try and move from that to an anthropological collective ethics after the break. Okay, so 10 minutes. It's now 10:32, so a couple of minutes after the bell. Thank you. All right, a break. Oh, I stop just for a bit.